Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Turnip's Digest. I am joined today by our good friend Raging Mandrill. How are you, sir?
I'm doing passably well on this wonderful Saturday morning. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well as well. It is a nice Saturday morning. I've been kind to both you and we got a little bit of time to sleep in somewhat.
Yeah, yeah, that was very nice. We went an hour later, and that was pretty clutch, I'd say.
Very good, very good. Yeah. So, before we start, Mr. Mandrill, I'll let you tell people where they can find you. I have a link in the description for you. But something I would like to remind everyone is that once again we have a full panel of Old Glory Club members. So if you kind of like what we're doing here, especially as it relates to the United States and American people, you can go find more at the Old Glory Club Substack, which can be very easily found just by searching for the Old Glory Club. But Mr. Mandrill, where can people find you, and what do you do for those unfamiliar with you?
Well, you can find me, like you said, at the OGC. I write for their Substack. I won't be appearing on any of their live streams anytime soon, unfortunately, because I have studies that interfere with that. But yeah, I do write on my own Substack occasionally, and I do video content on my own YouTube channel. So all of the usual places. Follow me on Twitter, etc., etc.
Yes, yes, fantastic, and he is a very fun follow. You don't know what argument he's going to be jumping into next. So if you'd like to see, if you
Yeah,
like to see,
I have a tendency to do that, don't I?
yeah, yeah. I mean, we all do, but I think you are probably in the top three for jumping into just things that I did not know people were arguing about. It's a talent.
Yeah, I have a talent as Doug the intern said once in our Telegram chat. He said, what did he say? He says, "Man, you just totally pissed off everybody else in the chat, and I'm kind of impressed by this." This is a talent for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So, with that, we actually have a very short document that we're looking at today, and it's from the king of neoconservatism, Irving Kristol, once again. We're going to be talking about the conservative welfare state. This is an article that specifically went out in the Wall Street Journal in 1993, if I remember correctly, and it's short. It's a newspaper article, certainly, so it's not going to be like what we've been going over. But there is a lot packed in here. His editorial way of speaking here. He's trying to sound approachable in some cases, and he's lambasting people in other cases. Is not going to serve him well if we're actually going to put this under scrutiny. This idea that conservatives should just just reform the post FDR, post LBJ reforms to just suit their nominally pro family needs, and just stop caring about budget expenditures and any negative consequences that might have. I mean, this is certainly the advent of certain conservatives thinking that money is really just numbers on a screen or numbers on paper that don't actually symbolize anything, the real or tangible that might be important. This is the advent of that thinking. So
Yeah,
and that's why it's extremely important here.
yeah.
Um,
As they say, deficits don't matter, right?
right. And Mr. Mandrill, I think that you might know a few things about economics, right?
I'm probably not as well versed as yourself, Mr. Turnip Seed. I'm not exactly a boy genius, unlike some.
Well, I wasn't asking you that for you to say that. I was more just trying to suggest that you might have studied a few things on your own time, and in relations to economic considerations, in relations to perhaps public spending, government intervention, how that affects people in society in the long term. You may have
Well,
some experience in that.
yeah, yeah. I typically autodidactically do research on my own, and in just being in the AA sphere, obviously, you're going to pick up some of the libertarian talking points inevitably. But yeah,
Right.
I've read Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics from cover to cover. It's a tome, so I've done my homework on this issue.
Right, and this is we might be approaching it somewhat differently than most other libertarians might. If you want to lump us under that line of reasoning, certainly we aren't Keynesians or something like that. Um, I think that being as we're looking over the conservative case for a welfare state, it might be worth pointing out how finances actually do directly impact a society. What happens if you do just spend everything now, use it for consumption, and then pass on the bill to your grandchildren, or print the money to make up the difference? What does happen? I think that might be good for us to explore as we continue throughout this piece.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
yes, so um, with no further ado, here it is. This is A Conservative Welfare State by Irving Kristol, from, yes, the Wall Street Journal, June 14th, 1993. And
Just the first sentence.
yeah, so this is short enough that I think we can actually go line by line, so that everyone gets a feel for how these neoconservatives operate in their rhetoric, how they are going to push their assumptions on everyone else, sort of browbeat anyone that might think that you shouldn't bankrupt the country to bankroll. Right now it would be boomers. At the time, it would have been silent gens and the so-called greatest generation. So he's going to browbeat you for not being conservative enough to just bankrupt everything to pay them more. Which, funnily enough, he also falls into some of those groups. So he would be on the receiving end of this increased generosity, as he's going to put it. So this first paragraph here, short and simple, he starts, "I had it coming. In my last article in this newspaper, I challenged conservatives in general, and the Republican Party in particular, first mistake there, or perhaps willful ignorance of conflating those two, to come up with their ideas for a reformed welfare state. Inevitably, my challenge rebounded upon me. Well, my friends, associates, and many correspondents replied, where are your ideas? Stop sermonizing and get down to specifics. I now rise to that challenge, though with apprehension, since my ideas happen to be rather controversial, and I fear many conservatives will be unappreciative of their merits." So, this is the framing that we're starting out with in the first paragraph here. The conservative treatment of the welfare state as told by these neoconservatives, which have very well infected any sort of mainstream conservative movement now. These were the people that would appear alongside, say, Buckley, and these other gatekeepers. It's why if you go to any Republican convention of any stripe now, the only people who aren't actually in favor of just bankrupting the country to support these welfare state initiatives are weird libertarians and nationalists. The mainstream GOP, Romney types and who not else, are all in line with just reforming the state to make it work better, reforming the welfare state to make it work better. So this is what we're starting out with here. This is sort of the germ of this idea that actually expanding on these Rooseveltian and Johnson administration policies are very conservative, actually.
So this is, you can even see the typical neoconservative tactic here, rhetorically, in action, which is like when he's telling them, "Oh, well, what are your ideas? Stop sermonizing. Get down to specifics." Right?
He's being told that. Yeah.
Oh, he's being told that. Well, anyway, yes. This is sorry, reading comprehension here.
Well, I mean, if you want to talk about neoconservative rhetoric, this is another thing that they'll do. Where they will say action needs to be taken, and they'll slam their fist down on the table, and then that inevitably leads people to say, "Well, then what do you want to do? Don't let us just come up with the ideas." So then, like we've seen in other paragraphs or other articles so far, he's going to say, "Well, I have the mature and controversial ideas." Every neoconservative paints themselves as a radical when they're the least from it.
Well, the mature and conservative. Anyway. Yeah, I guess what I'm seeing here, or what I'm sensing, is just the typical pattern, right? Which is, okay, these guys will say, "Oh, this thing isn't working. We need to do something different, and here's how we're going to do something different." And with that, you have this like usage of language, because I just don't like his usage of language here. He's got like this like, "Oh, I'm rising to the challenge. Look at me." Like, "Oh, these are controversial ideas, and you guys just are typical fuddy-duddies whose ideas are out of date." And this really strikes me as really grating. Like, I don't like this approach, and typically neoconservatives have a really weird tendency to use accusations of, my personal conduct, my morals and stuff as a way of a gatekeeping mechanism.
Right, and we're definitely going to be seeing that this essay.
And yeah, I'm just sensing this just in his language here. I'm sensing this dynamic already being utilized, because he's saying, firstly, well, my ideas are controversial, they're new. Whereas I reject that assertion entirely. Sometimes the simple truth is the easiest one, and the simple truth is your budget needs to be balanced, right? Like I've always been in favor of balancing the budget. This is just like basic governance. Ugh.
Well, that would certainly make sense. And this grandstanding, there's a reason that I put in the description the neoconservative case for the welfare state. This is sort of it's a bit drier, since the left was not nearly so deranged as it is now. Certainly the tendencies, proclivities, and other perversions were there, which is why we're in our situation now. But this is back in the heady days where conservatives were actually making the truly left-wing conservative case for the welfare state, or from policies from the FDR administration, and not the conservative case for transing kids or whatever. So, this is on the prelude to that. We have once we seed this whole Rooseveltian welfare state idea, then you can just go anywhere. Like, if they're not going to oppose this thing that they had opposed for decades at this point, what will they oppose? Well, it turns out nothing. But we can go to the next paragraph, just because I think the tone has been set very well. This is going to be where we get a lot of meat, if you will. So, Crystal writes, "Let me lay down the basic principles, the basic deficiency, some will say, of my approach. I shall, to begin with, assume that the welfare state is with us, for better or worse, and that conservatives should try to make it better rather than worse. And I shall pay no attention to the economics of the welfare state, which I regard as a secondary issue. What conservatives ought to seek, first of all, is a welfare state consistent with the basic moral principles of our civilization and the basic political principles of our nation. The essential purpose of politics, after all, is to transmit to our children a civilization and a nation that they can be proud of. This means we should figure out what we want before we calculate what we can afford, not the reverse, which is the normal conservative predisposition. In this respect, public finance differs fundamentally from household economics." So
yeah, hard disagree.
yeah. So elaborate. What do you disagree with, Mandrill?
So, I mean, first of all, like he's saying that public finance is different than household economics, and there's a wonderful any sort of budget is essentially like similar. You have your revenues, your income that you're bringing in, and then you have your expenses, right? This is very, very easy to understand, and maybe it's just because you've have some experience with accounting, or you've actually run a budget in Excel or whatever. But it's not actually that difficult to like allocate resources properly if you have an actual constraint, right? As this, Thomas Sowell notably said, like you have to have some constraint in order for people to be able to make these decisions. And even in a Rothbardian sense, or in a Austrian economics sense, right? If there is a constraint on something for a particular resource, and somebody has a very specific level of income or resource acquisition, that's going to help them determine in their preference schedule, right, their prioritization of what is important at the moment, and that changes moment to moment. So really, it's you're just simply saying, oh, but why can't we have what we want? Why can't we just find the way to pay for it after we determine what we want? And fundamentally, that's not true, in my view. Like I have this very instinctual disagreement with this, because it's really not hard to keep a balanced budget if if you understand what your inputs are.
Right, and we can break this down just bit by bit here. So, he's saying that we need to know what we want first, and then find a way to pay for it. and underlying this assumption is just the idea that, which, keep in mind, this is a guy claiming to be the true American heritage correspondent. Like, he is telling you what true American principles are. Don't check his background or anything to see if that's in accordance with what he's saying here. But he's
and
going to be.
also and also
But
he's claiming, sorry to interrupt, but he's also
yeah.
claiming to be a conservative when this is actually a very left-wing predisposition to economics.
Oh well, right, which is hence why this is the conservative case for the left wing thing. But he's going to be saying here, well, we can just look at our heritage and all these other things, and we can determine what we want the state to pay for, and we'll just find a way to find the resources using state action. And one has to ask: is this true for American or Anglo American, or really any European American peoples? Is this how their heritage works? That they don't devolve things down to the communal level. They don't have this sort of a strong independent identity on the local levels that perhaps in 1993 might have been a little bit more pronounced. Is this true that doesn't exist? Well, obviously it exists. You can look at any point in American history to see this existing. And for whatever reason, Crystal here is coming up with this new synthetic, completely artificial idea of conservatism, which is just it's when you vaguely help people in alignment with some moral principle. It's sort of like trying to import this paternalistic Toryism over to America in the 1990s that perhaps the British might know a bit more than us. So does this actually fit our civilization and heritage? This idea that the state can grow to whatever degree it wants to, acquire whatever resources it wants to in order for us to accomplish our goal? Well, no, not really. This is a very foreign to us, especially, where once upon a time, an American receiving some form of welfare from especially a public coffer would have been disgraceful. It would have been once again, as I keep repeating on this channel, it would have been a mark against their personal character. They've mismanaged something to where they have to go take from public resources in order to sustain themselves. It would be showing they're a net taker.
Yeah, it's really funny because this is definitely what you've just outlined is a very, very specifically Anglo opinion. State intervention and having a strong government is centralized is definitely something that's been commented ad nauseum in our circles because it always gets talked about from like a continental system versus an Anglo system. And so what he is basically saying is, well, we're going to take this more continental European strong state, and we're going to apply this to a people who historically are very independent and very much not in favor of a strong state government. Like this is a huge issue too. Like even back in like the 1700s or the late 1600s. For anybody who's aware of the original Duke of Marlborough, I watched this interesting television series called The First Churchills, and it's got this weird interaction between the Duke of Marlborough and William of Orange, and William of Orange is like, well, why can't we have an army? I'm the King of Holland, and I'm at war with France. Like, why won't England come in and help me? And so the Marlborough has to explain to him, well, actually, this is a republic. Or not a republic, I should say. But like this country has a very interesting predilection where we have a tendency to demobilize the army after a conflict because we don't need a large army. We rely on our fleet. And so whenever we go to war, we have to raise an army basically from scratch every single time that we do this.
Right, specifically from provinces as well.
Yes, and specifically from provinces as well. And so this idea that, okay, well, it's cheaper, right? It's a lot cheaper because you don't have to tax your population when your army is not actually fighting. And geopolitically, that is very advantageous to have that arrangement, right? From England's perspective, it means that there's a lot less in terms of taxation that you're required. You don't need a standing army. And so really what Irving is saying here is we need to go to something that is not not American in the Anglo sense of the term.
Right, exactly, and even some of the more continental types that did come over here tend to fall in line with that Anglo view. If you look at the people who would have supported, especially the old right in the United States, which would have been the 1920s, 1930s, through all the way through about the 50s or so, these people would be composed of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. You would get some Northern Irish, Scottish blend, especially in the upper South, and Germans in the Midwest. This was the old right's core supporting base. So even those continental Germans would fall in line with this view, and to this day, they're still one of the few demographics that you can take this as like a nominal, lighthearted measure for conservatism, I suppose, but they will still vote GOP in an election. Certainly not the Democratic Party. So, like I hinted to earlier in the first paragraph, that doesn't actually mean that they are conservatives, but it means that they are geared towards at least the rhetoric whenever it comes around. Crystal here, in his quest for just making conservatives be left-wingers, but according to his flavor, is completely dispensing with all that. You're right. And just a couple of other... So that's just the basic problem with this up here, assuming that the welfare state is with us for better or worse, and that we just need to reform it, which is a very conservative impulse. We've discussed this on the channel a couple of times now, that especially modern conservatism will tend towards reform only, and they will not do anything radical like actually getting rid of bad policies or instituting good ones. They have to reform their way into something better. So, is this the case? Is the welfare state with us for better or worse, just forever, and we just have to live with it? Well, as you, Mr. Mandrill, were hinting to at the beginning of this, no. Resources mean something. If you don't have resources, you're going to hit a wall and you will not be able to do things. So the welfare state that we have now, just looking at the amount of resources that it is running through, the money that it has to print to make up for it, and the actual revenue that is being collected to pay for it, is not sustainable. And every single young person knows this. They've been told this for their whole lives, that their grandparents are certainly receiving Social Security, but it will be an absolute miracle if they, by the time they are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, receive anything from Social Security, for instance. This is a common refrain. So that even in that statement that basically every young person knows now is an implicit assumption that resources matter and you will just run out of them and something will have to give. Crystal here in his 70s is when he's writing this, just basically sees that as a fact of life. The welfare state is here and we just have to reform it to be better. Just accept it. The FDR paradigm is here with us to stay, so is the Johnson paradigm, and we just have to live with it. We're all Rooseveltians now. So, did you want to say something, Mandrill? I thought you were going to butt in there.
No, I mean, so, like, how much do like, Social Security payments take out of people's paychecks every single month? It's not small. Like, it's at least $100, maybe more, if I remember correctly. Like, and that's even, like, rated for wages, if I'm not mistaken. But, basically, right, you have young people who are trying to, and this is where you start getting into the alternative conversation of family formation and being able to afford property and investment, right? So it is a common investing like assertion among people who are in more like financial circles to say that the money that you earn at 23 is way more important than the money that you earn later in life, because the money that you earn at 23 helps set you up in terms of investing because of things like compound interest, etc. And so if you're saying, oh, I'm going to take $100 a month or this much per month for Social Security and then another $80 on top of that for Medicare payments, what you're saying is I'm taking your money at a period of your life that is incredibly important to set you up. And you're actually not just stealing your wealth in the here and now, the $100 a month, you're possibly stealing thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars in the future by taking that money out of somebody's wages to pay for the old folks. And that's, of course, given the reality of compound interest, as I said.
Right, and there's a fundamental principle at play here that you and I, perhaps looking more at the Austrians, would know than someone that wouldn't be, which is that savings is a necessary thing in order to develop economically. This is not like looking at GDP on a graph development. This is actually quality of life. How can I have a computer or a bookshelf full of books or running water or whatever else? Well, someone previously had to have saved in order to employ those resources productively in order to get to this point. And we had to progressively save more to get fancier things. This is just basic economic development. You can't actually develop at the start or at any other time without having savings available. Otherwise, you're just striving to subsist. So this is another big issue with these welfare states, that you think conservatives would be all over that if they understood such a thing. If just paying out all of these welfare payments necessarily must either take from savings or debase the currency. Another thing that I think has been hammered to death as to why that's bad. Certainly anyone with a modicum of knowledge of, say, Roman history would understand why debasing the currency is perhaps a terrible idea. You would think that conservatives would be all over this, and rightfully so. If the welfare state is destroying our savings and thus our societal prosperity and economic development in a very real sense, you would think they would care about that, but Crystal is here to tell us that actually it's here to stay, so we might as well just make it somewhat better. So, okay, sure, if we grant that, which I'm not, but just for the sake of this stream being interesting, let's grant that it is here to stay and that we can't just do away with the welfare system. Is he going to say we just need to trim it down a little bit, cut the fat here and there, make it a little bit more sleek and perhaps more European looking at the time, somewhat more streamlined to, perhaps allow people to save more and align incentives better? If you couldn't tell by the rest of this paragraph, where he's saying that we just need to make it work with our moral principles, and so that we can pass a good nation on to our children, which he erroneously says is the purpose of politics. I don't know if that's actually the case. I don't know that any real analysis of politics would come away with this definition that he puts forward here, transmitting a civilization and a nation to our children that they can be proud of. So I don't think he's actually going to advocate for cutting the fat here in these welfare programs that are actively decivilizing us. In fact, it sounds like that he's going to use these moral principles as an excuse to just do whatever he wants, which is a very, very neoconservative move. If you thought the leftists were bad in saying that the Bible says whatever I want it to, so you should be a leftist, neoconservatives were doing this long beforehand. And Mr. Mandrill, just as a note, because I'm seeing it flash up on my screen, if I drop out, just keep going on the topic.
Okay, sure.
So, anything else there before we move on to the next paragraph?
No, we can move on.
Fantastic. So, here we go. Here's the kicker. Crystal says, it has long been my opinion that the conservative hostility to Social Security, derived from a traditional conservative fiscal monomania, leads to political impotence and a bankrupt social policy. Our Social Security system is enormously popular. If the American people want to be generous to their elderly, even to the point of some extravagance, I think it is very nice of them. After all, the elderly are such wonderful, unproblematic citizens. They are patriotic. They do not have illegitimate children. They do not commit crimes. They do not riot in the streets. Their popular entertainments are decent rather than degrading. And if they find themselves a bit flush with funds, they happily distribute the money to their grandchildren. Okay, so this is obviously not aged well at all. This was once again written in 1993 when the elderly were silent gen types, maybe some greatest generation.
Certainly not boomers. This is not the picture quality that I have of baby boomers generally.
Right. So what is that stereotype that you and most other youthful people might have of the boomer generation?
Well, as is typical with the flower powered generation, they tend to be a bit spendthrift, I would say. They do have illegitimate children. They do have, they did get divorced, many of them. I'm just laughing at that they do not ride in the streets. Oh, really? You mean to tell me that a bunch of left-wing radicals in the 60s and early 70s didn't ride in the streets? What?
Right, yeah. Our elderly now would have been at like the Chicago '68 convention.
Right,
Like that's
right,
like those people are old enough now to be the elderly that are receiving from this majoritively.
right. And I don't know if they happily distribute the money to their grandchildren. Like in the case of like my grandparents, yes, like like even to their own detriment. Like my grandma gave me every single birthday. She gave me a check every single Christmas, every single birthday, like without fail. And I got to the point where I was became an adult and I had a job of my own, and I never, because she's my grandma, I never said this to her, but like directly before she died. But I complained to my dad. I was like, why is she still giving me money? Like she could just give me the card. Like I'm a grown ass man with my own money and my own job. Like she doesn't have to give me her savings. Like save something for yourself, grandma. But yeah, that's not really the picture of self sacrifice that the current generation seems to have. And it's, of course, it's not all right. This is like a stereotype, but it's a true stereotype. Stereotypes are like exist for a reason.
Right, and my family tends to be similarly as generous, which is once again uncharacteristic of their generation, as noted by the stereotype. With all the Lutheran Church things that have happened in the last year, I've gotten to know quite a good number of people, and I have just heard absolute horror stories from these people, these real people going about their day-to-day lives, trying to start a family in this hellscape of a modern world. And in the face of an economy that is dead set against them ever having any sort of permanency on the land or with family or anything like that. And surely this would be the time, if any time ever did exist, to for these older generations to really step up and help their grandchildren actually get started, actually carry on the bloodline, actually establish themselves in some sort of community so they can get going, and then one day eventually help their grandchildren out should they need it. You would think that this would be the majority opinion taken by these great elderly, which once again, Crystal is not saying his elderly at this point in time are good. He is saying the elderly are good, which, to be fair, up until perhaps the 90s, might have been true. This might have been a general trend amongst the elderly, if we discount the fact that, say, the 1848 radicals perhaps were once elderly in their later lives. In the modern day, though, this is not what we see. What you see are a lot of baby boomers in particular that will extravagantly spend their money for purely consumptive purposes. This is why if you go on any cruise ship, it's all boomers spending as much money as they want to. They'll purchase all these boats and whatnot else, regardless of the means they have. They might remortgage their houses in order to continue to get extravagant or money for extravagant purposes. So I'm sure that anyone in the chat might experience this or know someone who's experienced this, which is generally a good indicator that it's perhaps more true than not. This is why if you talk about war statistics, if you say that everyone knew someone that was a casualty in a big war, that generally is a good indicator that it was a widespread occurrence, this problem of casualties. If everyone knows someone or was an experience of, or had experienced boomers being this sort of spending generation in their later years, it is a widespread occurrence. That's a pretty good heuristic to go by. So, yeah, let's reread Crystal's statement here. And if they find themselves a bit flush with funds, they happily distribute the money to their grandchildren. So I don't think that's the case, really.
Well, speaking of the cruise issue, yeah, my parents actually did take an Alaskan cruise once.
Well, it's not the issue isn't they've done it once. The issue is that you get these boomers that basically just live on them and spend the money as much as they want to, get back onto the land, and yeah. So
it's also like even the ones who are at least on the face of it, they're still actually like spending in excessive ways, right? It's not. It's a very much a general trend and like a social trend as these things go.
Right. And one might also ask, especially the boomers, like they are certainly one of the richest generations to ever exist. How did they get this extremely accumulated savings? Well, look at the family sizes that they had and that came after them. They were much less than the ones that came before them. Certainly, the children of boomers tend to have much less siblings than the boomers themselves had. So
yeah, that's true.
So let's look back here. What point is it if we're going to make these great claims about distributing money to their grandchildren if the grandchildren are much less in number than at any point in history? Even if we were to accept that, okay, sure, we're just going to deny all collective anecdotal evidence and say, okay, the boomers do distribute money very generously to the resulting generations. That's why you aren't having this sort of advanced generational warfare masquerading as class warfare right now between millennials and Zoomers and baby boomers. Yeah, so we'll just ignore that. There's not actually as much grandchildren, and our nominally our governments are making up for it by just replacing the grandchildren that should have been there with hordes of third worlders. Yep. So, which is a very boomer policy that specifically is laid on the hands of boomers. The greatest generation enabled it. They passed the laws that would allow this to take place, but it is the boomers that are currently importing people. So, this is obviously trash. It's not this way. If it was in 1993, it is no longer. They're patriotic. I mean, just once again noting back that now the boomer generation is the elderly. Would they have been considered the patriotic generation when they were younger? No, probably not. They were the hippie rebellious generation, which once again you can say not all, sure, fine, but this was the first real generation in American history that overwhelmingly tended towards this weird sort of Marxist philosophy, hippie philosophies that might have been offshoots of that that have since swung the nation leftward. So, yeah, patriotic, maybe not. They do not have illegitimate children. Well, currently, the boomers are the first generation to overwhelmingly engage in such illicit activity. So this hasn't stood up well at all. I mean, it was the boomers that took strong advantage of no-fault divorce laws, which one might consider to be a form of illegitimacy by historical standards. So
yeah, I mean that's real. Like I found out one of my. This is getting probably too personal. I shouldn't say that, but
okay. Consider it yourself, and you'll make that call.
Yeah, okay, I think we should move on.
And just this last part here, because I think this is perhaps the thing that is aged the least well. He says their popular entertainments are decent rather than degrading. Well, let's just think about this. What media channels are quintessentially the baby boomer media channel? What form of media consumption?
Legacy media.
Legacy media, specifically on what kind of device?
Television. The screen.
Exactly. Television. Is the television more decent than degrading? So once again, he's writing this in 1993, so maybe it was true then, but I don't think anyone can make the claim that television is less degrading than the other forms of media now. Like, I unfortunately had to sit through a few advertisements this Christmas during a few family gatherings, and they were awful. Not even like, you can choose some of the television programming that might be better than some other programs to watch at the same time, but the advertisements are everywhere. I don't think it's a stretch to say that the advertisements are psychological warfare. So,
at this point, they might as well be.
So, this is his foundation for a conservative welfare state here, for supporting the elderly, not really touching Social Security. He's in fact berating you for thinking that Social Security might be overbloated. In fact, he's saying it's all the better to just spend more on it. These are the reasons he's putting forward. Some conservatives still take the conclusion here, whether or not they knew the reasoning up to that point. So,
I mean, I want to actually, I want to dispute his assertion that Social Security is enormously popular. I mean, maybe that's true given the demographic breakdown of the United States still, but I feel like there was a very clear moment, maybe in the early 90s, because this is post initial election of Bill Clinton, with the whole Ross Perot candidacy, where there was a moment where there could have been some sort of thing if Ross Perot had gotten in, where you could address this issue, possibly. I think that Social Security being enormously popular is, as a statement, is probably not as true now as it was then. And the reason why I say that is as we've mentioned previously, the young people understand that, like, we're probably not going to get Social Security, actually. So is it popular if you're paying for something that you're not going to receive in return? Well, of course not. So...
Right. If ever there was a base for popular support, assuming that that's how the specific system works, for getting rid of Social Security, right when the last Zoomer hits the voting age would be the time. Like, it has never been more unpopular because, once again, and it's usually Gen Xers telling these younger people this, it's just the Gen Xers have paid into it long enough to where they've kind of flipped on the issue. These millennials and Zoomers have been told their entire lives that they're probably not going to receive a cent of this stuff that they're going to be paying. So if they have been told these things, they're either going to flip to, well, we need to reform this system and strengthen it, or we need to get rid of the system and do something else or nothing at all. And that also might be part of an explanation for why some Zoomers tend to be much more libertarian than perhaps other generations. If you go to these libertarian conferences, there's quite a lot of Zoomers there. Especially when you look at other generations before them. Millennials might be perhaps more socialistic, looking at this system that Crystal wants to strengthen. So they'll go in any direction that is specifically not what Crystal is advocating, because it is not going to help them. So we'll move on real quick, because now he's going to get to some hardcore statements. He says, so in my welfare state, we leave Social Security alone, except for being a bit more generous, perhaps.
Yes, give me more money.
Well, here's the next. If you say it, certainly all restrictions on the earnings of the elderly should be abolished as a matter of fairness. As for Medicare, well, conservatives believe in honoring thy father and mother, and the good book does not say that such honor should be limited only to parents or grandparents who are in good health and do not live too long. Medicare's cost is not a conservative problem, except for those conservatives whose good book is the annual budget. So, yeah, how dare you, conservative, think about the financial well-being of your children in the future, or the surrounding economic system, whether it's stable or unstable? You should be honoring, perhaps cultishly, those who came before you by spending as much money as possible for these state-sponsored welfare programs in order that they can perhaps make up for terrible decisions that they made during their lifetime. So, this is a classic left-wing tactic, not even to talk about the neoconservatives, who pulled this once again far more than the left-wingers are currently doing right now. Conservatives believe in honoring thy father and thy mother, biblical allusion there, and the good book does not say that such honor should be limited to parents who are in good health and do not live too long. Like, this is literally, oh, well, you're a Christian conservative. Well, the Bible says to do this thing that supports me. So really, you should just accept all these left-wing policies that are going to bankrupt your children, that are going to spike time preferences. We haven't even talked about time preferences yet. This is a very basic economic concept, despite the fact that it sounds high-minded and sort of ivory tower. It is your preference. It is a human preference for satisfaction now over the same satisfaction later. So if you can get one benefit that is the exact same now or the exact same later, you will take it now. And you can extrapolate from this principle, what trade-offs are you willing to make between future well-being and current well-being? Because typically you're going to have to make a decision, because savings, for instance, resource savings in particular, are a very good indicator of future well-being. It doesn't take much logical reasoning to explain that. Most people can just inductively reason out that if I have more savings in the future, I will be better off. Savings being whatever I find to be useful and productive. But if I can consume all those savings now, then sure, I'll be better off now. I'll have a lot of great consumptive experience, activities, warm fuzzy feelings, whatever it is that I want to consume it for. But then I'm going to be less well off in the future than if I had saved it. Crystal here really believes that we should just give up savings, which once again are at the lowest point in perhaps human history, and just give it to the elderly or the sick or whomever else so that they can spend it on consumption, which is not actually good for the people coming after this generation who's just being looted. This is this is exactly the best way to put it. Crystal, eat the seed corn. This is what they want. You have your seed corn stored up for your farm in the future, and you're being blackmailed by this 70-something-year-old neoconservative who's telling you that actually the Bible says that you should let him have the seed corn to eat because he might not have made the best decisions earlier in his life, or it doesn't even have to be Crystal, it could be anyone else. Same exact principle.
It's also like prioritizing one moral priority at the expense of every other possible moral priorities, right?
Right.
Why is this this is a commandment, right? Honor thy father and thy mother. So why does this particular moral prescription have to get placed on top of every other possible standard for moral conduct? Why this one specifically being the highest one?
Yeah, so
it's very interesting.
If I'm to just take the Lutheran and Catholic numbering of the commandments, he's referencing the fourth commandment here: honor thy father and thy mother, with no reference to what the first three preceding commandments were. I guess they just aren't important. These commandments that might have to do with a God that perhaps Crystal is not inclined to believe in, perhaps due to his upbringing or his heritage or anything like that. We're not going to see that, but the fourth commandment, the things afterwards that might be a bit more, we can generalize those a bit better to fit the neoconservative playbook. We can start haranguing Christians with that. To be perfectly honest, this is perhaps the most infuriating part of this book. It's if we have the meme right now of leftists saying the Bible means whatever I want it to mean, sorry, conservatives. This is what's happening here, and the neoconservatives are no less leftists than the left wingers that will harass you on Twitter. So this is really if you want to get into accusations of ancestor worship or something like that, this would be it. You're actively impoverishing younger generations, your future, your civilizational future, certainly, so that the elderly can consume as to their fancy. I'm kind of amazed that he wrote this in his 70s, being a direct recipient of these things, and didn't have an inkling of a doubt that this would be in bad taste, perhaps a little bit crass. No, he believes this, and so do the neoconservatives. This is why, if you remember back to 2012, Romney and all other good Republican moderates were conceding everything to do with welfare, except perhaps that it could be run better. We could perhaps do a little bit less with the bureaucracy, but the main principle is still there. This is why. This is the fruit of that movement. We're just going to pretend that the elderly have done no wrong and that they deserve your children's savings, so that they can consume it. Let's continue here. What I've highlighted so far were the really big points to establish. Now we're just going to get into some fun thought problems, basically. So he says, as with the elderly, so with children.
Hold on. As with the elderly, so with children. That is a statement that is oddly reminiscent of another statement that I have heard before, which some of you might have heard, which is as above, so below. How fascinating.
So, we'll continue. As with the elderly, so with children. Ever since World War II, weak-minded and budget-conscious Republican administrations have conspired with the liberals to cheat the children of middle-class and working-class households. The income tax deduction for children, now $2,500, would now be $7,500 had it been indexed for inflation. The next Republican administration should address this scandal, giving it the highest priority. The budget consequences are considerable, so perhaps we would want to phase in the indexed phase in the indexed increase over a 5-year period, but nothing less than that, I would say. So, let's just look here. So, 1993, and he's talking about the welfare state. So we'll be generous and say after FDR. Which Republican administrations existed after FDR and before 1993? Well, after FDR, we get Truman, Democratic. After Truman, we get Eisenhower, Republican. Was Eisenhower some weak-minded, budget-conscious Republican who was too tight with his belt and was too ungenerous with the poor? Well, no, and we discussed this, Grant Brooks and I, specifically on the Bircher stream. Eisenhower was supposed to be the person who cut and slashed the FDR administration policies that had been carried over into the Truman administration. He was supposed to be the one to finally do away with this monstrous welfare state that had eaten away at all these local institutions and methods of mutual aid that might have carried on up until this point. Did Eisenhower do this? No, he most certainly did not. Eisenhower, in fact, would strengthen these things and make it the Republican position to keep around these welfarist policies. So, Eisenhower may have gotten a few things right, but he was most certainly not some weak-minded, budget-conscious Republican. He mayhaps was a more budget-conscious than perhaps the Republicans of the 1990s, especially the moderate wing, but he was not in an absolute term, most certainly not. So after Eisenhower, who do we get? We get Kennedy. Kennedy gets shot. He's a Democrat. Kennedy gets shot. Then we get LBJ finishing Kennedy's term and then going into his own elected term, Democratic once again. He's going to strengthen the welfare state even more. So after FDR, we've had a succession of presidents whose sole policy prescriptions have been strengthen the welfare state and expand it or defend it. Great. Who do we get after Lyndon B. Johnson? Well, 1968 rolls around. We get finally a Republican administration once again, Richard Nixon. Nixon is in a rock between a rock and a hard place. He was flanked to his right by a welfarist Dixiecrat in the 1968 election, and flanked to his left by a welfarist Johnsonite by Hubert Humphrey in the 68 election. So Nixon, he's going to probably keep his support in New England and parts of California. He can't really drop the welfarism because all of these other political forces are going to go harder than he will and flip perhaps winnable Republican districts. So he's not going to go against welfare. He's not even going to make the promise, which ironically perhaps makes Nixon the more honest of these Republican candidates up until this point. 72 rolls around. Nixon wins in, I think, the second or third largest landslide in U.S. history. So he's going to win that, and he's not going to change his policy. He's just going to keep on with this sort of middle way sort of moderate reformism. Okay, so after Nixon, who do we get? Well, we're going to get Gerald Ford after Nixon resigns. After Gerald Ford, who is a Republican of the moderate variety, who are we going to get? We're going to get the Carter administration, who, despite being a Democrat, is actually going to perhaps streamline some of these things, cut down on bureaucracy, and sort of fix budgetary matters a little bit. After Carter, who do we get? Well, finally, we get the great savior of the neoconservative movement, the god of it,
Reagan.
Saint Reagan, yes. He's going to run on a platform of the most nominally libertarian economics you've ever heard of. He's going to slash government spending, slash bureaucracy. Perhaps contradictorily, he's going to funnel all the money into the military, but don't ask where the money's going to come from. He's going to beat the commies, and all these other things. Does Reagan actually cut the welfare state? Well, obviously evidenced by the fact that we have a stronger than ever Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and all these other things, no. In fact, in some cases, he's going to strengthen the provisions. So, you finally got this chance at a Republican administration that was saying the right things about, at least about the welfare state. Saying that it was bad, it causes dependency, it's going to bankrupt younger generations and whatnot else, and he's just going to do the exact opposite and strengthen it. He's going to buy Crystal's ideas here before Crystal put them down on paper. So that was Reagan. Who do we get after Reagan? Well, we get Bush 1. Bush 1, in keeping in line with his political dynasty and All of his other family members is going to be of the more liberal Republican variety. Famous CIA directors do not tend to be these great, high-minded, old right types that want to clamp down on the welfare state. And then after Bush 1, we are, of course, going to get the Clinton administration. So, by the time that Bill Kristol is writing this, this is absurd, saying that it's been weak-minded and budget-conscious Republican administrations that have been cheating children out of their tax deductions and their welfare policies. No, it hasn't been. Both parties have been just strengthening this welfare state as time goes on. They just disagree in the direction that it should be strengthened. This is particularly infuriating. Like this is just a rewriting of history here. They haven't indexed this one thing for inflation. Therefore, none of these people are really conservative, and they're conspiring with these other neoliberals, which is a word we're going to get to in a moment, to cheat children out of their familial savings. So obviously, this doesn't hold up to historical record, even by the time this was being written. But what do we get after that? He's making the case for tax credits or tax deductions specifically, not tax credits. So, what does this mean? Well, instead of just easing the tax burden, which would impact families as well, or easing the married tax burden, which is a separate category, we're going to add this Byzantine layer of paperwork and bureaucracy onto the tax code that nominally encourages people to have children. Does this actually bear out? Well, no, not really. This does not actually encourage people to have more children. And someone like Kristol might say, well, it's because you aren't giving them enough of an incentive, and fair enough. But once again, you could just cut their tax altogether, like other countries have been doing up until this point. So, if you actually want to have a pro-natal economic policy, you might find that it's the one that cuts taxes altogether. Certainly, say that I want to start a family right now and I want to get a job to do it. If I get to take home my entire paycheck, I could, in theory, start a family pretty comfortably right now. It would not be extravagant. We would certainly be having to budget pretty extremely. But this is how it would be in Oklahoma. Instead, you have to go through all this paperwork about tax deductions that may or may not exist still. In fact, I don't actually remember what this is on the tax code now. I did not actually get to research this in public finance last year. But this is a Byzantine way to actually just make it look like they're letting you keep more of your money, but you have to opt into it, and you don't just actually get to keep the money as you receive it. You have to go through the paperwork to see how much you can keep after they've already taken some off the top.
It's also a time issue as well, right? Because if you have to spend all the time researching these little areas in order to get more money, it's just the time that you would have to spend researching that honestly might be better put into like working, right? If you didn't have to spend the time, which is basically working for nothing, right? Calvin Coolidge famously said, "I want the American people to have to work less for the government." And as a conservative of that time period, basically was of the opinion that if you are working and your money is being taken by the government for tax purposes, you're basically working for the government for free. That's the way that he thought about it. And this is essentially the same principle, except now you have to fill out a bunch of government paperwork so the government could maybe find you an extra couple $100 here or there. Now, I make a big point out of this, and I was telling my dad over the Christmas holiday, because I was like, he mentioned that I would pay less in tax in moving to my current state, not California, and I basically said, well, absolutely, that's correct. If you just moved out of California, right, there's a lot of conservative states which don't have income tax. So, like in California, you're paying the 20% or 19% for your federal income tax, and then you're paying the 9.3%, which is, I think, the highest in the nation, if memory serves, in state income tax. So actually, you are paying a third of your income, of your annual income just to the taxes that are supposed to be used for paying Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid for the most part, basically to fund the federal budget. That's the point of income tax. So,
Right.
so like literally just moving to a different state makes all of the difference in the affordability of the basic necessities of life. And this is where people start complaining is, okay, you have this much money per month. Okay, so now you're being taxed federal income. Now you're being taxed state income. Now you're being taxed, whatever percentage for Medicare and Medicaid tax plus sales tax plus all of this other stuff. And this is what makes it impossible to form families and impossible for what should be a normal level of income, right? An absolutely average level of income. I mean, it just makes it impossible to acquire the property necessary in order to get married. This is the problem.
Right, and even if you were renting the property in order to be married, like, still, you have to account for the fact that you're going to have to pay for a child. How would you pay for a child? Well, certainly, most statistics about child costs are overblown. I forget what her handle is on Twitter. Mac, Kenzie Tuff or something like that. We'll harp on this. Yeah. She will say as a mother that there are specific things that you can very easily do that are actually pretty traditional in order to save a lot of money on having children. So just disregarding that issue, disregarding how the real estate market is or whatever else, just assume that you can have property, or you can access property at a low cost in this fantasy world that we're cooking up here, and that children don't cost so terribly much. You're still going to be limited by the amount of savings that you can produce for your children, which is a good thing. You want your children to have savings. You're going to be limited by the amount of development that you can afford for them. So, what do they need a device in this modern world in order to do something? Do they need specific books or whatever else? These things that they don't necessarily need, but might be good to have as you educate them, or as they try to do something new, or as you get into a hobby. Woodworking is not an inexpensive hobby if you want to teach them woodworking. Archery, hunting, and all these other things cost money. All of these things that once were ubiquitous in life for families, if not necessary, should be more available than ever in the modern world for you to access. That makes perfect sense. As we get more prosperous, you should be able to go back and do these old things for less of a cost. That should be what economic development entails, unless in like the archery industry or something revolutionary happens that ups the costs. Suddenly everyone wants to be an archer or whatever, but that's not what it is. So leave that out for a second. What happens if suddenly I am taking home much less money? Well, these things are going to have to go in some order. Obviously, me being a good conservative Christian or whatever else, libertarian, label doesn't really matter. I'm going to want to have children. But then now that I have children, that has a cost. I'm not going to just be able to borrow my way into having these things that perhaps I would have had without taxation. These things that they could have had. I'm not going to be able to borrow my way into that like a government, so I'm just going to have to go without it. For instance, I would much rather them have savings available to them. So this is where I think perhaps libertarians especially should have capitalized on this issue, being especially pronatal in their economics, instead of talking about trade tariffs or whatever else. It is extremely pronatal to slash taxes, especially the taxes that burden families. Not give them deductions or credits, but just to get rid of the taxes. Let them take home their money and immediately be able to do with it what they want to do. Which, once again, for most young conservative Christians, traditional Christians, or whatever you want to call them, they do want to have families. This is hold on. Sorry. So if you look at most, especially Zoomers of the traditionalist variety, they want to have children. They don't want these superfluous spending habits that perhaps their parents had. They, especially a lot of young Christians, they don't want to spend their entire budget on, say, drugs or alcohol or whatever else, though they might engage in some of that. They want to spend a good chunk of their money on families. They want to have a wife and children. Do they get to have that? Well, assuming they even did get to have a wife, actually making ends meet to get the family is actively hampered by taxation. So in this sense, I'm saying he's not going far enough here. This is a neoconservative compromise where he wants the tax code to stay as it is. He just wants this Byzantine layer of deductions and credits and whatever else to try to push people in a direction. Whereas if you actually just slash the taxes, which would also save for the amount of money that needs to be paid into bureaucracy or for filing your taxes or whatever else, this would have a much more pro-natal effect, especially in these red states like Wyoming or Oklahoma or Texas or Kansas or wherever else, where the vast majority of especially young people are still Christian. They are still traditionalist in some variety. They're on the trajectory to where they want to get married and have children. When I go to college still in Oklahoma, I can see certain classmates of mine getting married with the intent to start a family as they land a job out of college. This is not some anecdotal thing that doesn't happen still. There are still youth that want the family. It's just that, once again, this taxation money that is going to the government to ironically pay for all the elderly up here who have made it in some sense, this is money that's unavailable to them to start a family. It's extremely anti-natal, the tax system, especially the modern tax system. At least in the medieval times, you were giving up just raw resources to the Lord in exchange for protection that was very real. In the modern day, that's not so. You're giving up a good chunk of everything that you have in the form of currency, so that the government can do whatever it wants with it, including replace you or hamper your ability to form a family or a community. So, I think we beat this paragraph to death. Did you want to add anything, Mandrill, before we moved on?
No, let's move on.
Alrighty. So, he continues. The charms of this reform would, from the conservative point of view, be significant and various. It would be enormously popular, which is no small thing, but it would also be much more than that. These households represent the conservative ideal of the normal household, the household that exemplifies family values, and we wish to encourage such households instead of adding to their financial difficulties, as we've been doing. One could also contemplate unanticipated benefits instead of the unanticipated ills that are so characteristic of liberal reforms. After all, one of the things these parents could do is use the money for the children's education, thereby making school choice an actuality, not merely an advocated possibility. One might then begin to question, Mr. Crystal, why is it that going outside the public schools or having a choice of public schools or private schools or whatever else isn't the norm already? What system do we have in place to where we're going in this roundabout way, justifying this Byzantine taxation code in order to get people to just have the ability to educate their children in the way that is best suited for them, and to dispense with the masks and the illusions here? Why is it that Christians don't already have their own school systems set up, or at least the non-Catholic ones? Why is it that we don't have systems of classical schools and homeschooling co-ops already by 1993, to where we're justifying this Byzantine tax code as a way to encourage it? Perhaps that might be the place to look instead of coming up with these weak explanations for basically just going in the same direction that we always go, which is to make a cast of experts that are supposed to tell you how your taxes are to be paid, that you have to pay for, in order for things to work out properly. Maybe that the system should be fixed in those places rather than making up these weak excuses here. But having said that, I don't think someone like Crystal would be too terribly enthused by these Christian classical networks or these homeschooling co-ops that are springing up. I think he might find them to be the wrong kind of right-wing, or the wrong kind of Christian, the wrong kind of traditional. I get that striking feeling there. And anything on that, Mandrill?
No.
Okay, all right. So next paragraph, and we don't actually have too terribly much to go. He says, now, for the most contentious part, it is easy and attractive to discriminate in favor of large sections of the population. It is far less attractive, and makes us all uneasy, to discriminate against any section of the population. Yet such discrimination is absolutely necessary if we are to change the welfare state into something more deserving of that name. Okay, so is he going to say we're going to discriminate against people that are lax with their moral values in their life, or perhaps certain demographics that might abuse the system or have been directly harmed by overusing it? What is he going to say? The issue of discriminating against is more sharply posed when we consider the reform of welfare itself. The problem with our current welfare programs is not that they are costly, which they are, but that they have such perverse consequences for the people they are supposed to benefit. The emergence of a growing and self-perpetuating underclass that makes our cities close to uninhabitable is a demonstrable consequence of the present liberal-inspired welfare system. The system breeds social pathologies, crime, juvenile delinquency, illegitimacy, drug addiction, and alcoholism, along with the destruction of a once functioning public school system. So, let's just step back here, Mandrill. Is this underclass in these inner cities directly caused by welfare? Is there perhaps something more inherent or something more material than just we've started this Johnsonite system of Great Society welfare programs that have caused this? What do you think?
Well, I certainly think that there's a excellent case to be made for the Johnson era programs of the Great Society directly causing the growth of a urban underclass. I think that's a case that's been very well made. I haven't actually read Amity Schley's book on the subject yet. Maybe someday I'll get to it. But yeah, it's just a question of chicken and egg almost, right? Because is it the Johnson era programs, or is it something else? Is it like this was a specifically targeted, chosen client group that power has decided that they want to increase the numbers of and increase their shall we say, worst types of behavior in order to push other disfavored groups out of the cities?
Right, exactly. And then one might even ask this litany of issues with this underclass in the cities. Did that exist before the welfare system? I think that you can find historical record that says yes, it did, because even before the Great Society programs, you can find if I remember correctly, I think it's Time magazine, specifically, that was publishing articles. It might not have been Time. It might have been some other thing. It was a major magazine that is still around today. 1958, that was publishing issues saying that integration has not solved the crime problem. And with those headlines, you get two admissions. One, that they were trying to solve a problem, and two, that the problem was there beforehand in terms of crime and all these other issues. There was an idea that this perhaps violent underclass or self-perpetuating underclass, as Crystal puts it, might have been done away with if only they were integrated and equalized with the rest of the city's inhabitants. Which
it's also very
interesting in the 50s.
Yeah, it's also very interesting too that he says in the last sentence, the system breeds social pathologies, and this really shows you that he actually thinks like a leftist. Right, because the leftists will always say, "Oh, it's the system which is the problem. It's the system which is the problem. If only we could just tinker with the system and make the system work for people, or something like this." When in actuality, it's not the system. The system, I mean, maybe it exacerbates it in one way or another, but it's not actually the system. This is an inherent thing, right?
Yes, if only we fix the system, society's problems would go away. We can perhaps fix the problems of certain peoples if we just make the right system. Now, I'm not saying that you can't mitigate them, but I don't think you would fix them.
and any sort of, and this is just general my opinion on any sort of system, right? Any sort of system is going to have attributes that are good to it and attributes that are maybe less good. Like every sort of, and this is just because you're talking about a system, you're talking about a structure, right? And any sort of architectural design or technical structure, any sort of technology that you could discuss, it's always going to have specific benefits, but it's also going to have very specific design constraints and vulnerabilities and weaknesses. It's no technology, and that includes social technology as well as a bureaucratic structure or system, is going to have weaknesses and things that it's not really designed to do all that well.
Right. And so this is this I think is a issue here, because it's not really clear what he's talking about. Because at first you might be able to reason that he might have gotten the objection that the welfare system is discriminating against the youth in favor of the poor, or in favor of the elderly. Or now he might be saying that it's discriminatory in either direction. I can't really tell what his opinion is, where he's saying the welfare system is either discriminating against, in the liberal sense, these under self-perpetuating underclass populations, or is he saying that it's discriminating against them because it's breeding these things? I think this is just poor writing, but assuming that he means the latter, which is a typical conservative position where he's saying that the current liberal welfare system is specifically discriminatory because it harms these self-perpetuating underclasses, I'm not going to buy that. This is a good way to deflect their issues onto another group of people, which ironically, when the conservatives say this, they say they need to take responsibility for their own actions, and this is why welfare is bad, is because they can't take responsibility anymore. It's actually very irresponsible of conservatives, because they are deflecting the problems of this, quote, self-perpetuating underclass onto another group of people that institute a system that somewhat harmed them. It's a good way to blame anyone else but them for their problems. So really, it's the Rooseveltian establishment, or the Eisenhower administration, or the Johnson administration that's the real cause of their problems. So they need to blame them and everything that led up to them. It is functionally no different than saying that slavery is the issue, or that segregation was the issue, so that they can blame it on something else. It's just the conservative way, because in this sense, you kind of get to choose if you're on welfare or not, in a certain sense, whereas the other things were not imposed. So it fits that great conservative want for voluntary consent to these actions.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that I agree with this, your assertion that this paragraph is poorly written. I think he's being deliberately obtuse here.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a good other perspective. So, the next paragraph will shed a little bit of light. He says, the neoliberal response advocated by Mr. Clinton during his campaign, which calls for 2 years and out for all able-bodied welfare recipients, is a fantasy. It will not happen. We are not going to see state legislatures and the huge welfare establishment ruthlessly dumping welfare families onto the streets. Public opinion will not stand for it. Liberal politicians will not be able to stomach it. It is merely a rhetorical diversionary tactic, and conservatives who are now attracted to it will end up distancing themselves from it as fast as they can. So, this is very telling. He's calling Mr. Bill Clinton a neoliberal, and he's using that word with disdain. Where does that word come from? Who is the type of person to use the word neoliberal? Well, neoliberal tends to be a very left-wing word. In fact, it's a very Marxist word, which might be indicative of this of the origins of perhaps of this neoconservative movement, of these circles that the father of neoconservatism is running around with. Why might he call Mr. Clinton a neoliberal instead of just a liberal or something else? Well, it's because he's not just an old liberal in this retconning of history that supported these great welfare programs and socialistic endeavors. No, he's a neoliberal, which means that he doesn't actually believe in fully bankrupting the country. He only believes in partially doing it. So this is a tactic used by especially left-wing elements, now on the right even, not just on the left, where you criticize this sort of a more fiscally conservative shift in the 90s and the 80s specifically. You call it neoliberalism, and you say that neoliberalism is the problem of all of Africa and the third world. It's the problem of the poor in these Western countries, and really they all just need to band together in order to fix their problems. So if you look especially in the dissident categories right now, it's no shock that the people crying neoliberalism at everything that happens are the same ones that monstrously support third worldism to get across their dissident endeavors. So this is just an interesting give here. I'm not accusing him of third worldism specifically. I'm saying that this word is very telling of Mr. Crystal. But look at how he oscillates here. He goes from saying we need to structure the welfare system around conservative principles. We need to make it what we want because it is here to stay. But then here, he's saying, well, we can't actually do what we want even if we wanted to. And he's saying that implying here that this is an attractive position put forward by the Clinton administration. He is saying here that, well, actually, we can't just do whatever we want. We have to adhere to the public opinion and to the politicians in power. So, in actuality, he has gone from, in the course of like 2 pages, saying, well, we need a welfare system that's in line with conservative principles because it's here to stay. But now that we're into the fact that his opposition is perhaps saying things that might be amenable to these Republican conservative types, suddenly he's saying, well, actually, good neoconservatives can't stomach anything against public opinion. It's foolish. You're not going to win, and it's just going to set us back. So, this is a major give on his part. So, Mr. Mandrill, do you have any comments on this paragraph here?
Not particularly.
Alrighty, so we'll continue, because I think it's going to heat up here as we get closer to the end. Crystal continues, the key to conservative reform would be A, to discourage young women from having an illegitimate child in the first place, and B, to discriminate between welfare mothers and mothers on welfare. Such discrimination must have a clear moral basis. So, this is the most radical thing you're getting from him.
That's a distinction without a difference.
So, yeah, he does seem to be separating here for all the talk of incentives and boiling down the whole study of economics to a study of incentives. Crystal and his neoconservatism seems to have completely neglected the fact that why are there welfare mothers? Well, maybe it's the fact that welfare provides an incentive for mothers to become welfare dependent and then to use that to their advantage. Is there a way to really get rid of that? Well, you're either going to upset his conservative sensibilities, as he laid forward in the first few paragraphs, or you're going to have welfare mothers. You don't get this happy in between in a welfare system where you're giving out money ostensibly for free, otherwise it's not welfare. You don't get that, and also not have people that abuse it. You might get some sort of a dissident that says, well, actually, high trust societies can have these systems, and they won't have abusers. But no, they don't. They will have a less occurrence of them, but you're not going to get rid of the abusers of a public welfare system. This is why in Elizabethan England and the resulting decades, the poor laws, the poor welfare laws, had to eventually be ramped down because they were being abused. England at this point in time was an extremely homogenous society of the infamous 130 plus IQ Anglos, but even they were not able to manage this without corruption. And this is because corruption, while it may be influenced by certain demographics, is not actually purely a demographic problem. Corruption comes about as a result of an environment. If you have a system that says executes people for corruption or dishonesty, you're going to see less corruption regardless of the demographics, or you're going to see less reporting of it, which itself is a corruption problem. So this is just one issue here, where he's trying to have his welfare system, where the welfare system itself prevents corruption, which is not going to happen. You would have to actually take very traditional measures in order to prevent corruption from taking place, but he would not be for that, because that would be unpopular and too traditional and perhaps budget-minded. Why shouldn't he? Would immediately flip, as most neoconservatives do as soon as you suggest harsh penalties for corruption, to, oh, well, who cares if certain people get perhaps more benefits than they're allowed? It's generous. Certainly he didn't care that the elderly got more benefits earlier, so that he doesn't actually have a moral break here to prevent him from going in that direction. It's the direction he's heading towards. And here's the other issue as well. Why might women be having illegitimate children in the first place, especially at this point in time to where they need to go onto welfare? This didn't used to be as prevalent, especially in the history of the country, the United States. What changed? Why can women get by having all these illegitimate children? What is enabling them? Well, we have since gotten rid of a lot of moral laws, especially on the state level, that might have penalized people for having children out of wedlock. I mean, certainly that's backwards and puritanical, so we can't do that. And then we also have these welfare systems, which he's probably going to address here in a second, that allow them to financially sustain themselves after this happens. We have divorce laws that allow them to get divorced if they were married, thus allowing them to create illegitimate children as they want to, in spite of whatever their marriage status might have been. So this whole thing is just fanciful nonsense. This tiny little paragraph that he just inserts here, it's worthless already. So we can get into specifics, and then Mandrill will ask you for comment. He elaborates. He says, mothers on welfare includes married women with children who have been divorced or widowed or abandoned by their husbands, as if husbands are the ones doing the majority of the divorces. Most such women have little connection with any kind of underclass. For the most part, they have middle-class aspirations, subscribe to family values, and create no intergenerational class of welfare independence. Their stay on welfare is usually less than 2 years. They don't like being on welfare. They exit from the welfare population by reason of remarriage or getting a job, sometimes after diligently taking vocational training. They are not a problem population and deserve our generous assistance as well as our sympathy. So then the question arises, why is this neoconservative, this supposed traditionalist who was berating conservatives in an essay on a previous stream for not hearkening back to classical principles of governance, why is he now wanting to subsidize these strong, independent women who perhaps had their own families? Why does he want women in the workforce instead of at home? It's a good question. And you can make this criticism without even ascribing a value analysis to working women or stay-at-home mothers. I'm just saying he's being inconsistent here with his own principle of berating people for not being conservative enough while also trying to throw women into the workforce and away from the home, and using welfare perhaps as a means to rocket them in that direction. This seems very unconservative and untraditional to me. Mr. Mandrill, any comment on these paragraphs?
Yeah, so, I mean, the abandoned by their husbands thing is interesting because it's totally the opposite of who initiates the divorces for the most part. So, I mean, for him to suggest, oh, well, this isn't, a woman problem is just, statistically speaking, just simply not true.
Right. This is a classic thing that has bled over into most traditionalists and conservatives. This idea that whenever you're talking about the poor downtrodden mother, of which something bad has happened to her, it is never her fault. The system only helps these people. They've only been abused, and it's the evil husbands that have done this, or they've been widowed, which I don't think is actually a category that's discussed anymore. But it's always the husbands that do this, and then the poor downtrodden mother just needs our support.
It's always this weird like twisting of the assertion that everything is the men's responsibility.
Right, exactly. We're going to have chivalry without actually giving any of the benefits of chivalry to men.
Exactly.
Men are supposed to be chivalrous knights while also not having a wife below them. They're supposed to have equal say in their marriage. Maybe not having as large of a family. They're certainly not going to get land and status in society, but they are expected to carry on the duties of a chivalric knight. They're supposed to, without all these things, essentially make themselves a doormat. And you'll see a lot of pastors that advocate this thing, thinking that it's very traditional, sort of hearkening back to this Arthurian aesthetic that men should be chivalric. But we're certainly not going to give men any of the great benefits of chivalry, like a well-ordered and structured household, a properly structured household. Certainly that would be sexist, and no Christian has ever been sexist before. So that's this paragraph here, and he's going to continue. Welfare mothers, on the other hand, usually end up on welfare as a result of their own actions. So we're just going to pretend that the vast majority of women who have been divorced or perhaps even abandoned, which is in the modern day perhaps not the medieval system of abandonment that you're thinking of. We're just going to pretend that the mother had no problem with that. It was all the husband's fault. Welfare mothers, on the other hand, usually end up on welfare as a result of their own actions. Young girls permit themselves to get pregnant and to bear a child because the prospect of going on welfare does not frighten them.
Oh, you don't say.
Hold on. This is a very interesting distinction. They permit themselves to get pregnant and to bear a child. What could Crystal have meant by this? Why was this not just assumed? What is he suggesting here?
Yeah, that's an interesting sentence in with a modern context.
Well, I mean, even in the 90s, like this, I'm sure you could catch this in the 90s, being as it was law then for over a decade. Why are these two disconnected? I just a question. I don't know. Doesn't sound too very traditional or conservative.
Yeah, usually pregnant and to bear a child should go together. Like he's unnecessarily repeating himself, you would think.
Yeah, and this is a newspaper. You don't want to unnecessarily repeat yourself. So we'll continue at the start of the sentence. Young girls permit themselves to get pregnant and to bear a child because the prospect of going on welfare does not frighten them. Welfare permits them to leave homes that are often squalid or worse. It provides them with support in cash and kind, food stamps, housing allowances, Medicaid, that is in many ways superior to what they could earn working at the minimum wage. Okay, so he's oscillating to this, now he's oscillating back to the tight-belted conservative argument that the welfare is actually too good. Now it's too good of a system, and we need to clamp down on it because it's replacing the lowest wage rate. So I don't know. I think that this might just be happening regardless of what welfare system you're having, because you are offering free money specifically to a certain demographic. That is the structure of welfare in all places. So I think that this whole thing is just him trying to strike a classic neoconservative compromise where he's saying we need to get rid of the unreasonable things and do the reasonable things without actually having any meaning or distinction. I just find this passage to be particularly gross. I don't like that. So we'll continue, Mandrill, unless you have anything to add.
Let's continue.
Okay. So he says, these girls should be made to look upon welfare not as an opportunity, but as a frightening possibility. It follows that they should receive no housing allowance. This is probably the most important change of all. Having your own apartment in which you can raise your child can be seen as fun. Living with your child in your parents' home is a lot less alluring. This would especially be the case if the mother received no food stamps and was ineligible for Medicaid. She would have to rely on the hospital clinic. The child, on the other hand, would be eligible for food stamps and Medicaid, as well as a children's cash allowance. But the net effect of such reforms would be to reduce the mother's income by 30% to 50%, at which point there is little to be said in favor of welfare from her point of view. There is, of course, the danger that she won't spend the money on the child, but that is true of the present system as well. So he just defeated the purpose of this entire paragraph. I wasted my voice saying all of this because in this last sentence here, he's saying, well, yeah, the incentives are still not aligned properly. She probably still won't spend it on the child, but the present system doesn't do it either. So we're just going to cut things here while berating people for cutting things about the elderly. This is very self-defeating, and this is a classic neoconservative rhetorical trick. I don't know if anyone's caught this in the things that we have read. They will give their whole spiel, and then at the end, to make themselves seem reasonable, they will just give the objection to it without elaborating. It makes them sound reasonable, sound mature, developed, level-headed, while you have wasted all of your time reading through all of this. If anyone wants any writing advice, do not do this. Do not defeat your whole point in the last sentence here, because it wastes our time and it's not convincing. Having said that, he is right. This system does not fix the incentives, this thing that he is advocating for. At this point, you are subsidizing children because the children themselves are now tied to the benefits, not the mother. So if we are to just take this at face value with no other things added onto it, the more children that the mother gets, the more benefits that are provided, just because it's now tied to the child itself, the illegitimate child specifically. We have not fixed the system at all. We have just clarified the incentive. Ready to continue, Mandrill? I think we can knock out these next couple paragraphs.
Yes.
Okay. So Crystal continues, in addition, able-bodied men and mentally healthy men would have no entitlement whatever to welfare. That's an interesting disparity. If they are alcoholics or drug addicts or just allergic to responsibilities, they can rely on private charities. remember the Salvation Army. The general rule has to be, if it is your own behavior that could land you on welfare, then you don't get it, or you get very little of it. So, once again, are we going to just ignore the fact that perhaps divorces and marriages might be due to the mother's own behavior, or even an abandonment without the explicit paper signing of a divorce? This is a very strange thing, and I would once again caution anyone in the audience of these traditionalists, so-called. This is something that's happening especially right now in the present. Neoconservatives branding themselves as traditionalists, the real conservatives, the real traditionalists. They do this specific thing, where they will say that anything bad that happens to women is the result of men, and anything that bad that happens to men is their own responsibility. Red Hawk, John from Knights of Dissent and I covered this a couple of weeks ago, probably over a month ago now. So you see this a lot, especially in churches now, as they become much more feminized. They have to appeal to a female demographic because a lot of the pastors themselves don't actually have a backbone or a place to stand on. They're too afraid of their congregation thinking they're controversial or the wider community, so they'll tell people what they want to hear. And if the congregations are especially feminine, then it's going to be this litany that women do no fault, that they cannot have any sort of punishment leveled upon them by a government, and that men have to bear the responsibility. So just keep this in mind. He did say he was going to discriminate, and he proudly wears it. So will a lot of these pseudo-traditionalists in the modern day. This is just know that this is not in any way traditional. Once upon a time, if a woman was caught engaging in all this illicit extramarital sex that was resulting in children, at some point she would be harshly reprimanded by the authorities on moral grounds, legally. So this is something that is most certainly not traditional. In fact, some societies would brand women with an A to show that she was an adulteress and that you should not trust her with your progeny. This has been popularized in certain novels, but it did exist nonetheless, and not just in Puritan societies, but also in some continental European ones. Maybe there was something to that. Maybe there was something to having these harsh, negative penalties associated with sleeping around. Maybe that's the traditional thing, because it did exist in history. I don't know. I mean, Bill Crystal here is just, or not Bill, Irving Crystal here is just telling me that we just need to accept that women get the easy way out, and that men get to bear the whole thing, and that's traditional. So, anything there, Mandrill?
No, you're absolutely right.
All right, we'll continue. Such a reform of welfare, as I am proposing, will surely be denounced as cruel and judgmental. It would indeed be cruel and unfair, too, if all those currently on welfare, their situations and characters formed by the current system, were summarily incorporated in the new system. A phasing out procedure would have to be invented. But I would argue that it is crueler to entice people into the blind alley of welfare, where their very humanity is dissipated and degraded, than to sternly warn them off. In social policy, consequences ought always to trump intentions, however benign. So,
I agree with the last sentence, but
yeah. I mean, I agree, I would agree with most of this. It's just basic question here. He's saying this. Is he actually applying this? What was his policy towards welfare for the elderly earlier in this essay? Did it in any way match what he just said here, Mandrill?
No.
Yeah, whenever it comes to the elderly, welfare is great. You can have it in any quantity you want, the more the better. It has no ill effects. But for every other circumstance, for some reason that he's not in, for instance, Irving Crystal was not an illegitimate child, I don't think. He is not a mother having children out of wedlock. He's not in those categories. So for some reason, this is much harsher in this essay. But when it comes to the elderly, people that receive Medicare, perhaps Medicaid, Social Security, suddenly this whole paragraph, this warning doesn't exist. It has no ill effects on the elderly, as if their psyche too doesn't have any sort of changes resulted from welfare. So
no, of course not.
Well, we'll continue because we're about done here. He says, the judgmental issue, however, does get to the heart of the matter. A conservative welfare state should express conservative moral values. Where are they? Just as a liberal welfare state tries to impose liberal moral values upon us. It should discriminate in favor of satisfactory human results. Like what? Not humane intentions. In the end, the American people will have ample political opportunity to decide what kind of society they wish to live in, what kind of welfare state they wish to live with. But they will never have such a choice if conservatives fail to offer them a conservative vision. And that's where the piece ends. So
it's fully inside of the framework of we're going to have a welfare state, but you have to pick one.
Exactly. So, ladies and gentlemen, your great options put forward to you by the real conservatives, the true traditionalists, the people really looking at the causes and effects of our of our systems. They want you to know that you have a choice between a fully liberal welfare state or a not so fully liberal welfare state, as was just articulated in this piece. One might even find the idea that conservative welfare states, a conservative welfare state, is an oxymoron, to be outmoded. That just means that you're a bigot. Certainly, neoconservatives are not shy of using that word: bigots, racist, sexist. I mean, you're probably all of them if you try to go back to the old way of thinking. Trying to think that this is just oxymoronic and perhaps moronic in general. So, any last comments on that last paragraph there, Mr. Mandrill?
I mean, it just speaks for itself. I mean,
awesome. All right. Well, that was the conservative welfare state, and the reason we went over this once again is because there is a strong current of conservatism that is very pro-welfare. They're very happy to make themselves look compassionate and sort of paternalistic by saying, we're going to help all of these people with welfare schemes and punish the people that abuse it. Or in this case, disincentivize the people that abuse it. It doesn't have as good of a ring to it. So it's still there. It's in your main conservative party, no matter which Western nation you're in, really. It's the default position. You're a weird libertarian if you think otherwise. Disregard the fact that it's very traditional not to have these welfare states at all. They're very modern. They were a very socialistic, new liberal phenomenon, especially in the United States. But oh well, that's just what we have to live with. And I'll just correct myself there for a second. The South, the Dixiecrats specifically, would initiate community level or state level welfare schemes. And to be perfectly honest, I'm fine with that because that's part of devolution. Is you get these regional varieties where policies are tried and they either fail or succeed, or they take the character of their locality. Fine. The welfare state, however, is most certainly not traditional. The Dixiecrats did not initiate the welfare state. They initiated state level poor policies and widow pensions and whatever else. So I'll just correct myself there. But otherwise, this is most certainly not traditional, and certainly it's a new invention in conservatism. I would have more respect for these people if they just said, we like these people, the elderly or whatever else, and we dislike single mothers because they don't vote for us or whatnot else. It would be far more honest, and they would stop screwing up other things by making this like some sort of moral foundation that they have to build off from. Instead of just making it the end point of their thinking. I'd appreciate the latter much more. So, any final thoughts, Mr. Mandrill?
Well, I mean, that would be much more honest of them, but, you wouldn't get as much support if you didn't make yourself seem as if you were a moral actor, unfortunately.
Right, yeah. I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, I mean, it's a simple statement. Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty much it. I think that's all I got to say on the issue.
Yeah, so now you all can see how well the neoconservatives' ideas have aged. This is younger than anything else that we've read so far, and it's perhaps the thing that has aged the least well. Just to pick the Austrians, because we were using them earlier on in the stream, you can typically find an article by Murray Rothbard or Mises or someone else, and it'll be from like 50 or 70 years ago, depending on which of those two authors you pick, or 50 to 80 or 90 even. And it will typically still be relevant, and it will have aged very well. It won't sound idiotic, if you will. Whereas Crystal here talking about how virtuous and patriotic and deserving of wealth the elderly are just because of how virtuous they are, has most certainly not aged well. And anyone could have seen that coming in the 90s. This idea that the elderly are always going to be this way is a fanciful fantasy. So, I just I thought this piece would be good not only to show where this current of welfarism comes from within modern conservatism, but also just because it is aged so poorly that it's a miracle that anyone still holds by these ideals. Like typically, if an ideal or a philosophy or a political manifesto is discredited just by the passing of time and the unfolding of events, usually people abandon it, and it's seen rightfully as this idiotic attempt to make something happen that wasn't meant to be, or that was perhaps failed from the outset because it was contradictory to reality. Neoconservatism, however, has continued to cling on to any real right-wing movement, even going as far to rebrand itself as traditionalism or classical conservatism or something else. The neoconservatives have lived like cockroaches. You can't stamp them out, and they will infect these movements. So I think those are my final thoughts. We'll move on to super chats now. It's not very much to get through today. Saddam Hussein, the Indefatigable, for $9.99. Thank you very much. That was very generous, sir. I very much appreciate it. He says, cannot watch live. The Bab al-Mandab calls. Reagan's national security strategies belie his liberal foreign policy, as well as his insistence on neocon levels of defense spending at home. Godspeed. Yes, and indeed it does. So this is another thing as well that we didn't actually touch on. One can make the argument that the bloated military state that we have today, and I think that if you want to know the specifics and the issues with it, the best person you could go to is our good friend Paul Fahrenheit, since he has been talking about the need for extreme reform if you are to have a military. One can make the argument that we didn't get into today, that the military state, the military-industrial complex, is a welfare state on its own for these sort of neoconservative types. We didn't even talk about that yet, and that itself is an extremely liberal policy. Certainly nothing traditional nor conservative, and it very much erodes, as we mentioned at the beginning, this heritage, this fabric of American society, of independence, of pioneer settlements, having to make it on your own and with your community, and planning accordingly. Having this welfare state really does just erode both at the independence and at the idea that this is almost adventurous. You don't go out into the prairie and settle the fields with barely anything, without the chance of death or hardship. If you have the welfare state, it removes that. It takes the energy out of the activity, out of the adventure. You don't get this heroic group of people anymore that are living on their own, by their own means, using their own productive measures with their families and communities. It's gone. You can just go back to the welfare state, which is a floor that prevents you from experiencing any of the real hardships of living out in the fields or even in the cities now. Like that itself has something to be said for it. So, thank you very much, Saddam. Once again, these donations are what allows this show to take place every Saturday. So I appreciate any donation, no matter how large or small. I will remain very grateful going into the future as this continues. So especially because I think a lot of these things need to be said. You see right now in the modern day, there's a lot of neoconservatives that kind of are infecting dissident movements, or even some dissidents that are sliding towards neoconservatism. So that's my spiel there. Did you have a comment on the super chat, Mr. Mandrill?
Well, see, I don't know. Like the classically conservative discussion on Reagan's defense spending is, it was necessary because we had to outspend the Soviet Union. I don't know. I don't know anymore.
This is where like a concept like economic calculation might come into play, that you don't actually have to number for number outspend the Soviets in a military battle just because they aren't going to have as good of equipment as you will to as much people, just because of the calculation issue. But that's neither here nor there, and I'm sure that might be a good topic for another stream with a few logistics and military people. Perhaps you and Fahrenheit and a few others might be interested in that.
Yes, that might be interesting to do at some point.
Yeah. So, alrighty. With that, I think that we're about ready to close out. So, Mr. Mandrill, just in case people weren't here at the beginning, who are you? What do you do? What is your niche? Where can they find you? And all of that. I think they'd like to hear.
Sure. Okay. So other than on the OGC platform areas, there's Substack and sometimes on Pony Express. I do streams and videos on my own YouTube channel, and you can find me in all the usual places. Twitter. I'm on Substack. I have the writer's curse on Substack, which is I come up with far more article ideas than I seem to have time for to write. And I always have this weird problem where, and I hate this. I hate that you can't actually make drafts on your Substack account on your phone, because I'll think of something when I'm wandering around, just doing life, and then I forget the article name that I thought of.
Right.
And
yeah.
Like I'll think of it like a week and a half later, and I'm like, damn it. But yeah. Other than that, I do typically military geopol stuff, foreign policy. I'm really big into all of that stuff. That's my niche. I don't mind being pigeonholed on like some other people in our circles. I like my rut, and I'm going to stay in it.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I can encourage people to go check out Mr. Mandrill's articles on the OGC. And I am saying this, and Mr. Mandrill knows this full well, in spite of the fact that I tend to disagree with some of the things that he writes on there. So by all means, go check it out, because at the very least, it'll start a conversation, and at more, you might agree with it and find that it's worth reading more over at the OGC. So go check him out. And with that, I think that we are about ready to wrap up. So you can find his link in the description. It's a Find My Friends link, much like mine on all of my other videos. So go check him out there. You'll find all of his social media platforms there. And we will be back next Saturday morning discussing some neoconservative thing out of here. The culture war is next. We could go over affirmative action. There is so much more we can do in this neoconservative reader. It's a wealth of just modern conservatism and what's wrong with it. And they're using their own words to explain it to us. So I'll see you all next Saturday. Thank you everyone for attending today.